There is a woman locked in a scream, and she has been screaming for 3,500 years. Her mouth is stretched wide open. Her head is tilted slightly to one side, and the expression frozen on her face is so raw, so human, that the archaeologists who lifted her out of a wooden coffin in the hills above the Nile could not look at her the same way after. They gave her a name that was never hers. They called her the Screaming Woman, and for nearly a century, everyone assumed they knew why her mouth was open. They were wrong. Because when scientists finally slid her body into a modern scanner and looked inside her without cutting a single wrapping, what they found did not explain the scream. It made it stranger. It ruled out the easy answer, and it left the most disturbing question about this woman completely unanswered. For decades, the story people told about open-mouthed mummies was simple and comforting. A lazy embalmer, a jaw that dropped after death because no one tied it shut, a random accident of decay. Nothing more, just gravity and neglect pulling a dead face into the shape of a shout. That is the explanation you will still read in older books, and it is almost certainly wrong for this woman, because everything about how she was buried says she was cared for, treasured, and prepared with expensive materials shipped across the ancient world. Someone spent a fortune preserving her, and they still could not or would not close her mouth. Today, we are going to go through exactly what the scans revealed inside this woman, who she was, why her scream cannot be dismissed as a mistake, and why the physical evidence points to a moment of suffering so sudden that her own body locked around it and never let go. Stay with me, because the part everyone finds shocking is not the scream itself. It is what her body was doing at the instant it froze. Most people who see her photograph look away fast. The open mouth, the sunken features, the sense that you are looking at a real person caught in a real moment of agony. It is easy to treat her as a ghost story, a spooky image passed around online. But she is not a myth. She is a specific woman with a specific age, a specific set of ornaments on her fingers, and a specific place in one of the most powerful families in ancient Egypt. And the more precisely modern science pins down those details, the harder it becomes to explain her face. She was found in the winter of 1935 when an expedition from a major museum was digging into the hillside beneath a tomb at Deir el-Bahari, on the west bank of the Nile across from Luxor. This was not a random patch of desert. It was the burial ground of the relatives of a man named Senmut, one of the most important figures of Egypt's 18th dynasty. Senmut was the royal architect who designed the Great Terraced Temple for the female pharaoh who ruled around 1779 to 1458 BCE, one of the very few women ever to hold the full power of a king. He was close to the throne. He was trusted. And in the ground beneath his own service tomb, his family was laid to rest. In one of those burials, inside a plain wooden coffin, the diggers found her, an unnamed woman. No royal titles carved into the wood, no inscription telling us her name. Just a body, remarkably preserved, lying on her back with her hands crossed over her lap and a face twisted into that unmistakable open-mouthed cry. The excavation notes from that season describe her in cold, clinical language. Skin tanned, hard and dark, fingernails and toenails still present, eyes closed, and then 3 words that jump off the page, mouth wide open. Here is the first thing that should make you uncomfortable. For a body this old, that expression should not have survived at all. The muscles that hold the jaw in place normally relax after death. The mouth tends to fall open, yes, but slackly, loosely, the way a sleeping face goes slack. What this woman has is different. Her mouth is not merely open. It is stretched, taut, fixed, as if the moment of the expression was captured and then set in stone before her body could relax into the ordinary blankness of death. Something held that expression in place long enough for the preservation process to make it permanent. And that is the thread that runs through this entire investigation. What held it? If buried history unsettles you the way it unsettles me, stay with this one, because what the scanner found inside her chest and skull turns a spooky photograph into a genuine forensic puzzle. And the deeper we go, the fewer easy answers remain. Now, to understand why her scream matters, you have to understand what should have happened to her body and did not. In the classic mummification of the Egyptian New Kingdom, the period she belongs to, the process was brutal and precise. The brain was removed through the nose using a hooked tool. The internal organs were cut out through an incision in the lower left side of the abdomen, dried separately, and stored. The empty body was packed with salt, dried out completely, treated with resins, wrapped, and sealed. It was an assembly line of the dead, refined over thousands of years. That is what a well-prepared body of her era should look like on the inside. Hollow, emptied, cleaned out. She is not hollow, and that is where the modern chapter of her story begins. A team led by a Cairo University radiology professor, one of the leading experts in scanning ancient Egyptian mummies, brought a portable CT scanner to the garden of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, mounted on a truck, and moved her fragile body into it. CT scanning fires X-rays through the body from every angle and reconstructs a three-dimensional image of everything inside: bone, dried tissue, hidden objects, all without unwrapping or cutting anything. It is a virtual dissection. They could open her up without touching her, and when the images came back, the first surprise was already waiting. Her brain was still there, shrunken, desiccated, resting at the back of her skull, but present. No hole had been cut in the base of her skull to remove it. The delicate bone at the top of the nasal cavity, the part that is always broken during brain removal, was intact. No one had reached inside her head. And it went further. Her heart was still in her chest. Her lungs, her liver, her spleen, her kidneys, her intestines, all still inside her, dried and collapsed, but never removed. There was no embalming incision anywhere on her body. No cut, no opening. The organs that should have been pulled out and stored in jars had simply been left where they were. For a moment, this looked like proof of the lazy embalmer theory. A sloppy, cheap, careless job. Organs left in, mouth left open, corners cut, case closed. Except that is not what the rest of her body was saying. Because while her insides told a story of a shortcut, everything on her outside told a story of wealth. Here is where it gets strange. On the third finger of her left hand, she wore 2 rings. One was a scarab beetle carved from red jasper, set on a band of silver. The other was a scarab of green jasper mounted in gold. The scarab was the ancient symbol of resurrection, of the sun reborn each morning. These were not the ornaments of a forgotten servant. They were expensive, deliberate, meaningful. And on her head sat a wig, elaborately braided, extending down both sides to her shoulders. This was not a woman thrown into the ground and forgotten. This was a woman dressed for eternity. And then the analysis of the materials on her body turned the lazy embalmer theory to dust. Scientists took tiny samples of her skin, her natural hair, and her wig, and ran them through infrared spectroscopy and other tests that identify chemical fingerprints. What they found were not cheap local substances. They found juniper resin, imported from trees that grew in the eastern Mediterranean, hundreds of miles away, prized for its antibacterial and insect-repelling properties. They found frankincense, one of the most valuable substances in the entire ancient world, a gum resin carried across deserts and seas from southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa. This is the same frankincense that Egyptian expeditions sailed to the fabled land of Punt to obtain under the very female pharaoh Senmut served, the same substance found in the tomb of Tutankhamun. And it was on her skin and in her wig. Her natural hair had even been treated with henna, the reddish dye Egyptians used to keep their hair looking dark and youthful. That word, imported, is doing enormous work here. The Greek traveler Herodotus, writing centuries later, recorded that mummification in Egypt came in tiers priced by wealth. The richest received the most lavish treatment. The poor got the barest, cheapest version. The materials on a body are a receipt. They tell you, across thousands of years, roughly where the deceased stood in the social order. And this woman's receipt reads like that of someone with real standing. Frankincense and juniper were luxury goods, and someone paid for them to be applied to her skin and combed through the fibers of her wig. The wig itself has its own strange story. When the scanner looked closely, and later when the fibers were analyzed, it turned out not to be human hair at all in its main body, but braided fiber from the midrib of the date palm, coated with a dark crystalline powder for color and sheen. For a long time, no one even knew how such wigs were made, until archaeologists uncovered an actual ancient wig maker's workshop, also at Deir el-Bahari, containing wigs frozen mid-construction and a small sachet of the very same dark cosmetic powder found on her braids. She was, in other words, wearing a piece of specialist craftsmanship, the product of a dedicated trade, applied to her body for beauty in the afterlife. This is not neglect. This is investment. Sit with that contradiction for a second. Her organs were left inside her, which for a century meant careless, poor, second-rate. But she was buried in gold and silver, wrapped in a costly imported wig, and coated in some of the most expensive embalming materials on Earth. Those two facts do not fit together under the old explanation. You do not spend a fortune on frankincense and jasper rings, and then get lazy about the one thing that would keep her mouth from falling open. Something else is going on, and the researchers realized that the open mouth might not be a mistake at all. It might be a record. That realization is the second clue. Now we have to figure out what a mouth can record. To understand what her face might be telling us, the investigators did something clever. They compared her to two other Egyptian mummies who share her terrible expression, because she is not alone. Across all the thousands of preserved bodies recovered from Egypt, only a tiny handful were found with their mouths stretched wide open like this. And two of them are famous. Two of them have been scanned, and two of them come with a story. The first is a man. For over a century, he was known only as Unknown Man E, one of the most disturbing mummies ever found. He was discovered in a hidden cache of royal bodies, but he was wrong in every way a royal mummy should not be. He was not wrapped in clean white linen. He was covered in the skin of a sheep or goat, a material the Egyptians considered ritually impure, unclean. His organs had been left inside him. His face was frozen in a scream even more violent than hers. Everything about his burial screamed punishment, disgrace, a soul deliberately denied a peaceful afterlife. For decades, no one could name him. Then modern science stepped in. In 2012, DNA was extracted from his body and compared to the DNA of the pharaoh Ramesses III, who ruled Egypt in the 12th century BCE. The results were conclusive. They shared the same Y chromosome lineage and half their genetic code. This was the pharaoh's son, and history had a name waiting for him. Ancient court documents, a 5-meter-long judicial papyrus, described a plot hatched inside the royal household to assassinate Ramses III and put one of his sons on the throne instead. The plot was led by one of his secondary wives, and her son, a prince the documents call Pentawere. Separate CT scans of Ramesses III himself revealed the truth of that plot in his own flesh. His throat had been cut, a deep wound hidden for 3,000 years beneath the wrappings, with a protective amulet tucked into the wound by the embalmers. The conspiracy was real. The king was killed. And the prince, the papyrus records that he was found guilty and that he took his own life. The scans of Unknown Man E found his lungs strangely overinflated, a possible sign of death by suffocation or strangulation. A disgraced prince, punished even in death, buried in impure skin, denied proper embalming, his agonized face left open for eternity as a final mark of shame. His scream, in his case, may well be the accident of a deliberately botched burial, a punishment written on a face. But the second comparison is the one that matters more, because the second screaming mummy was not a criminal. She was a princess. Her wrappings identified her as a royal daughter and royal sister, most likely the sister of a king from the very start of the 18th dynasty, the same dynasty as our woman. And unlike the disgraced prince, she was buried with care. Yet her mouth, too, was locked wide open. When scientists scanned her, they found the answer buried in her arteries. She had severe hardening of the coronary arteries. She had, in all likelihood, suffered a massive and sudden heart attack. She died fast in what may have been a spasm of pain, and her body was preserved before the expression could fade. Do you see what is forming here? Two roads to the same frozen scream. One is neglect, a face left open because no one bothered to close it. The other is something far more unsettling, a body that seized in its final agonized moment and set hard before anyone could smooth it away. The question the investigators now faced was simple and chilling. Which road did our woman travel? The careless one or the agonized one? If forensic mysteries like this are why you are still watching, subscribe and stay with the investigation, because the scan results push her firmly toward the answer nobody wanted to say out loud. Everything about her burial argues against neglect. Remember the frankincense. Remember the juniper resin, the gold ring, the silver ring, the braided imported wig, the henna in her hair. The team examining her stated it plainly. The funerary techniques used on her body, the wig, the rings, the pricey imported embalming materials, the wooden coffin, all indicated good mummification quality. This was not a rushed or contemptuous burial. Whoever prepared her wanted her to be beautiful for eternity. And in Egyptian belief, that mattered enormously. They believed the spirit needed to recognize its own body after death. They took great care to close the mouths of the dead, tying the jaw to the skull, precisely so the face would look composed and peaceful. They knew how to shut a mouth. They did it as a matter of routine. So why is hers open? The scan gave the investigators a mechanism, and it is one of the eeriest phenomena in all of forensic science. It is called cadaveric spasm. Ordinary stiffening of the body after death, rigor mortis, comes on gradually, over hours, affecting the whole body, and eventually fades. Cadaveric spasm is different. It is instantaneous. It strikes at the exact moment of death, and it affects only the specific group of muscles that were violently contracted in that final instant. It is rare, poorly understood, and it is associated with death in the middle of extreme physical or emotional stress. Its most famous appearances are on battlefields and at drowning sites, where the dead are found still gripping the weapon or the reed they clutched as they died, their hands locked so tightly around it that the object cannot be pried loose. The body freezes around the last thing it felt. Apply that to a face. A woman experiences something so overwhelming, so agonizing, that her facial muscles contract violently, wrenching her mouth open in a cry. At that exact instant, she dies. And instead of relaxing, as a dead face normally would, her muscles lock. They seize around the expression and hold it rigid. Now, bring in the timing. The Egyptian embalmers likely began working on her body within roughly a day and a half of death, while that spasm still gripped her face, before the natural processes could loosen it. They could not close her mouth because the mouth would not close. The contraction had made it impossible, and rather than force it, they preserved her exactly as she was, sealing that final scream into the record for 35 centuries. That is the reading the investigators arrived at. The open mouth is not a lazy embalmer's oversight. It is the fossil of a feeling. It is a woman's last conscious moment, captured by her own nervous system and frozen in place. She died, in the careful words of the study, screaming from agony or pain. And here is the detail that makes it worse. The scan could not tell them what caused that agony. They searched her body for a cause of death and could not find one. There was no hardening of the arteries like the princess had, no obvious fatal injury, no wound. She had mild wear on her joints and spine, the ordinary aches of a woman of about 48, and she had lost a few teeth during life, but nothing that kills you, and certainly nothing that kills you screaming. Whatever happened to her in that final moment left no mark on her bones and no trace on her organs. It touched only her face. The event that froze her expression is, physically, invisible. We can see the scream. We cannot see its cause. That is the master question of this entire story, and the scans deepened it instead of solving it. What did she experience in the last second of her life that was violent enough to lock her face into a permanent cry, yet gentle enough to leave the rest of her body completely unharmed? A shock? A seizure? Sudden, overwhelming pain from something internal that has since desiccated beyond recognition? Grief? Terror? We are looking at the physical imprint of her final emotion, and we have no way to name the thing that caused it. That's the third clue, and it is the one that refuses to close. Now we have to be honest about what all this does and does not prove, because there is a quieter, more skeptical voice in this story, and it deserves a fair hearing. Does the frozen scream really prove this woman died in agony? Not with certainty, and the researchers themselves are careful to say so. The strongest counterargument comes from the broader science of studying mummies. One leading authority in the field, whose foundational work on the scientific study of mummies is cited across the discipline, has long cautioned that a mummy's facial expression does not necessarily reflect what the person felt at the moment of death. A face can be reshaped after death by many forces that have nothing to do with agony. The way the body dried out, the rate of decomposition before preservation set in, the simple pressure of the wrappings pressing on the face for centuries. Any of these can pull a dead expression into something that looks like emotion, but is only physics. And the study's own authors concede the point directly. The true circumstances of this woman's death are unknown. The cause of her screaming appearance cannot be established with certainty. That is the honest scientific position, and it should stay on the table. So no, this is not proof that we are looking at a photograph of a woman suffering. It might be a spasm. It might be the slow, blind work of decay dressing up a neutral face as a scream. Coincidence and chemistry are real, and the humble answer might be the true one. But strip away every dramatic reading, and the plain facts that remain are still stranger than the fantasy. Here is what does not go away. This was a cherished woman, buried with gold and silver, imported frankincense, imported juniper, a costly wig, in a proper coffin, in the family plot of one of the most powerful men in Egypt. The people who buried her had the skill, the resources, and the religious motivation to close her mouth. And they closed the mouths of the dead as a matter of daily routine. And they did not close hers. Whatever the ultimate cause, her mouth resisted being shut, and people who cared about her chose to preserve her exactly as she was, mid-cry, forever. You do not need agony or spasm to be unsettled by that. You just need to look at what is actually there. A loved woman, expensively prepared, left screaming on purpose because there was no other choice. And if even the cautious version of this is true, it means something quietly haunting about the world she came from. It means the people of 3,500 years ago, whom we so casually file under ancient and primitive, were capable of preserving a single human moment so completely that we can still read the shape of a final breath on a woman's face today. It means that mummification was not only a religious ritual, it was, by accident, a recording device, one so precise it captured an expression the woman herself never chose to leave behind. Her family could not give her a peaceful face, so they gave us the truth of her last one instead. Think about what modern tools are going to do with people like her next. The scanning is getting sharper every year. DNA recovery is improving. The same techniques that put a name and a murder onto a nameless screaming prince may one day reach back and tell us who she was, whose family she belonged to, and perhaps, buried in her dried tissues, some chemical shadow of what stopped her heart. We named the prince. We may yet name her, but right now she is still anonymous, still uncatalogued by history, still a woman without a name. Here is the one question that will not let go. We can measure her age to within a few years. We can identify the trees that gave up their resin for her skin and the mines that gave up the metal for her rings. We can see her brain resting at the back of her skull and count the teeth she lost while she lived. We can see, with perfect clarity, the exact shape of her scream, and we cannot tell you what she was screaming at. The most precisely documented moment of her entire life is the one moment we cannot explain. And there is a final, quiet unease running underneath all of this. Her story, since discovery, has been one of neglect of a different kind. After she was found, her body was handed to a medical faculty in Cairo, where mummies were dissected and studied. At some point during those decades, a clean rectangular hole was cut into the front of her chest, almost certainly by a scalpel during an examination that was never fully documented. When she was later moved to the Egyptian Museum, more damage followed. Photographs taken over the years show the destruction creeping across her, her abdominal wall collapsing inward under poor storage conditions, the two halves of her wig, once joined on her head, drifting apart. The scans even show her openings enlarged, where packing that once plugged them was pulled out long after her death and never returned. She survived 35 centuries in the ground almost intact. It was the modern world that started to take her apart. The one person who might explain her has been slowly damaged by the very institutions meant to protect her, and pieces of her story have gone missing along the way. There is one more echo, and it is the strangest of all. The man whose family plot she was buried in, the royal architect Senmut, vanished from history himself. Near the end of his queen's reign, somewhere around her 16th to 20th year on the throne, he abruptly disappeared from public life. He had built two magnificent tombs for himself. He was never laid to rest in either one. His fate is unknown. So we have a nameless woman screaming in his family's ground, and the master of that ground gone without a trace. Two silences, side by side, 3,500 years deep. She is still there. She lies today in a museum store in Cairo, an anonymous woman with a wide open mouth, her jaw stretched around a cry that no one living will ever hear, holding on to a secret her own body recorded and refuses to release. 3,500 years of scientists have looked at her. Not one of them has been able to close her mouth or answer the question it keeps asking. And whatever she felt in that final frozen instant, it is still in there, sealed behind the scream, exactly where it has always been, waiting. If this is the kind of buried history that keeps you up at night, watch the next investigation playing on screen right now, because the discovery in that one reaches back to the same silent world and pulls another secret out of the dark.